Hi, welcome to Bridging the Gap, a video series where we explore collective research perspectives from Indigenous peoples across the globe, the Diaspora, and the African continent. I'm your host, Jay Whitebear, and today we are at MIT Lincoln Laboratory with John Nwagbaraocha.
I'm John. I am an assistant group leader here at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, where the government comes to us to ask to modernize their current infrastructure. So I do research in software architectures, hardware architectures to help transform the government's existing architectures, leveraging DoD standards and also commercial best practices.
Oh, amazing. So MIT Lincoln Laboratory, for some of the people that are not familiar with the lab in general, what is their main purpose in the research space?
So we are categorized as a federally funded research development center, or FFRDC. So we primarily focus in doing research for the Department of Defense, the DoD, in a variety of areas. We also support some other government agencies and efforts in the United States.
Oh, wow.
Leveraging DoD standards and also commercial best practices.
Oh, so what kind of led you to choose this particular research focus and Lincoln Laboratory in general?
So a couple of things. Growing up, I was influenced by Dwayne Wayne from A Different World, and LeVar Burton as Geordi LaForge in Star Trek. That was my first opportunity to see a black engineer doing engineering stuff on television. Before that, I wanted to be a doctor, so I was always interested in science and engineering. And so that told me that, I didn't know that field existed, and that's kind of what made me gravitate towards engineering in particular. The other thing was the Manhattan Project that was done during World War II, where essentially a coalition of countries came together to really try to answer a tough problem. And I always wanted to work in an environment like that. And most of the national labs in the United States and the federally funded research and development centers, they're extensions of the Manhattan Project, but really focused on specific mission areas and different problems that the government needs to solve.
So I'm curious, and your background is engineering, and I also have an engineering background. What made you choose the government and national labs versus like commercial industry versus maybe academia at some point?
A couple of things. Number one, corporations tend to be driven by a bottom line, and that's really kind of what drives them to that's what motivates them to keep going. The thing that gravitated me towards federally funded research development centers was the fact that their motivation was really purely on the research. And this is a non-for-profit organization, so profit isn't our motivation, but purely the ideas behind research and development. Really doing research for the sake, sake of doing research.
So you have this research background, you have this engineering first, you have this space, and then jump into the national labs. But you're coming into STEM from a very, unique pathway than I think maybe some of the other engineers in the space. I think we know what the predominant demographics of engineering are, generally white male. What has been your experience as you've come up the ranks? I know you had a unique path of the lab as well, and what are your perspectives around that journey?
Interesting question. A lot of it, oddly enough, is driven by my last name. So in undergraduate, in college, we had opportunities to do research, like internships or co-op positions. And a lot of the times my resume was kind of put into the pile of, no, we're not going to go down this path, because people immediately saw my last name. And this is what a recruiter told me. People would immediately see my last name, and they can only really support U.S. citizens. So I was kind of forced to put U.S. citizen, even though I was born and raised here. I was kind of forced to put U.S. citizen on my resume so that companies would take note of that and not put it in the reject pile. And so that was one of those first things that, right out of the gate in college, I really saw, this is something that I need to be aware of, because I never ran into it, nor did my parents really tell me that that would probably be an issue, because it's my last name. I've kind of like
So last name, what is the origin of your last name, and what is your diaspora story? Like, how did you come to have your particular last name, and how is it relevant to your background and your family?
So my dad is from Nigeria, Oriri, Nigeria. I know I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. My mom's from Memphis, Tennessee. So they both came from a background of sort of pull them up by your bootstraps. My dad came over here with just a suitcase in the 60s and a dream of getting an education. My mom grew up in the projects of Memphis, Tennessee, and so they were both fortunate enough that they had family that supported them. And so they both went to college. They were both part of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And ultimately they met in Boston. Oddly enough, their first date was at the top of the Prudential.
So cute.
and probably one of the reasons why I love Boston. But that was one of those things where they both kind of lifted themselves up from the bootstraps and met, and I was born, me and my brothers were born.
You know, the bootstrap analogy, I know that's like a very common metaphor analogy for, you know, how people express or kind of gear themselves towards a certain path in the U.S. Is that how you identify, you know, your story as a bootstrap story, or do you think that there are probably more significant challenges in these spaces beyond that?
I would say Bootstrap is probably more aligned with my parents' story. My story is they went through that struggle and they just wanted the best opportunities and the best for me. So it was kind of up to me to continue that and not drop the ball,
Right,
so to speak, and, you know, and continue the family legacy, if you will.
How do you identify yourself? Like, you have, you know, a father who is kind of directly from the diaspora, and then you have kind of, I'm assuming, African-American mother. How do you, in particular, identify, you know, what is your identity in the U.S. based on these different perspectives?
It's a hard question to answer, but I'm primarily a classic African American. My dad's from Africa, my mom's American. So I do identify with my Nigerian heritage, but I don't speak the language. So there's certain, I can't say that I'm truly Nigerian. That's just me speaking. Only by last name, only because I went there when I was once when I was 2 years old. I haven't been back, you know, things like that. But still, I have a great appreciation for African and Nigerian culture in general.
Do you think, like, in the future, like, going back to the continent and kind of reconnecting to that might be something you'd be interested in or see yourself doing? Or?
Yes, my wife is from Uganda, so we went to Uganda a couple of years back. So that whole experience really enlightened me to, you know, things going on in the continent and broadened my horizons. So I do eventually want to make it to Nigeria as well one of these days.
What were your assumptions before going to the continent, and then, like, how did your views basically change after your trip?
It was more how my views were before I met my wife, because I think I didn't realize that technology was in Africa at the extent it was. But she enlightened me to sort of, you know, how things were in the continent, specifically Uganda, and things like that from a technology perspective, if you will. But it wasn't until I got there where I saw, like, it's interesting that you could tell it's a developing country because they're still building up infrastructure.
Right.
And you hear about Chinese investors coming to the continent to invest in it, but seeing it firsthand was very enlightening. Like, oh yeah, they are here building up infrastructure, and that kind of actually spurred in my mind, why isn't the U.S. Or why aren't other companies investing in the continent? It's an untapped resource of both knowledge and work power that the world, you know, needs right now.
Kind of overlooks a bit, yeah. So you were on the continent and you got to observe some of the technological development that was going on there. Have you had a chance to actually collaborate with any researchers on the continent, or do you see yourself doing something like that in the future?
No, I would love to, though. It's something that I really think, once again, it's an untapped resource. And the thing that I like about collaboration with people of different backgrounds, not only cultural but racially, is that you get a different perspective on how to solve problems. And I think a lot of folks on the continent have, I don't know if it's whether they're being ignored or not given the opportunity, but being able to collaborate with them at a technical level would be great, because it's just another perspective, or another way, another group of people who might think about a problem differently.
Maybe some experience with that, like in your current work, where you've seen like diverse or collective perspectives where they may have benefited the laboratory research or benefited your personal research?
Yes, so some of the project, it's more of a female-male to sort of a diversity dynamic. A lot of the teams that I work on are really filled with a lot of men. And so I think recently one of the projects that I worked on, we had a woman who was technical as well join the team, and it was interesting because she brought just a different perspective on how to look at a problem and solve a problem that a lot of the dudes, so to speak, weren't really,
Or really like
yeah.
owning. I like it. That's very interesting. So I guess when we talk about like these collective perspectives and like how to bridge the gap between these perspectives, both in our current work on, in this country and globally, I think there's a lot of efforts ongoing, particularly in the laboratory. I know both you and I have worked together on like ERG projects and things in the past. Do you think those are actually addressing the issues of bringing in these diverse perspectives, or do you see some additional challenges in that space?
I would say we're trying, but there are definitely challenges. I think one of the ERG that we both are a part of and supported, we do a lot of outreach. So I think part of one of my goals as being part of the leadership of that ERG was trying to do a little bit more outreach to not only college age folks, but also people at the elementary and high school level. So really it's more shaping minds early and introducing people to engineering early so that they realize that it's an opportunity, something that they haven't really been involved with. Because that's really what influenced me at a very young age. I saw someone on TV that was an engineer that looked like me, and that's what inspired me to get into the field. So it's more of letting people know, oh, people like you do this work, and you can do it too. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a slightly challenging question. So I know ERG work is a big part of Lincoln Laboratory, and I know this is going across different diverse groups at the lab. But there's a lot of research out that talks about there being an unfair onus on people of color to participate in these kinds of things. And do you see that happening, or do you have a different perspective?
It's like a second job. So yeah, there's a lot of onus on the ERG members to really kind of keep it going. But I think one thing that the laboratory has done right is at the leadership level, at the sort of, if you think of it, the CEO level, there is a diversity and inclusion person in that office. It used to be in HR, but now this is like a dedicated role at the top level that is really kind of lending D&I support to our organization, but also support to the ERGs. So it's like someone who has resources that we can that can help the ERGs sort of offload some of the work that the tedious work that we do, to do, or administrative work that we do to help keep ERGs running. But it's a kind of a double-edged sword. So some people believe ERGs, their whole role of it is to be more grassroots, but it's or more self-sufficient and from the grassroots level. But it's one of those things that you just have to balance. And I think it's important for the leadership of our organization, or whoever organization, to realize that ERGs are providing a benefit. Because a lot of my management organizational skills were honed and developed by participating in ERGs, and I leveraged a lot of that knowledge when I went onto my project or program work. So it's kind of it's a lot of work, but done right, you can manage things to benefit not only your organization but your individual projects.
what do you think might be the next steps? And first we're going to focus on local and then go a little bit global. But what do you think might be the next steps as far as diversity, inclusion, ERGs, kind of this collective space? Like, how do you think we should go forward in kind of widening, or I should say bridging the gap?
I think a lot of it has to do with knowledge. So I think we're at a tipping point, if you will, where a lot of people who could be allies, if you will, are now coming to the understanding that they need to understand the roots of some of these problems that sort of create that divide. Once they understand what the problems are, they can help us and, well, everyone kind of close that gap a little bit, so that enabling them to make a little bit more of a diverse workplace. Because knowledge is power, as they always say, and that's true to form when we talk about diversity and inclusion, because the more informed you are about a culture and people's backgrounds and things and struggles, if you will, the more empathetic, sympathetic, and also the more you really understand where people are coming from and understand some of those limitations or roadblocks that have been put in people's way, whether systematically or non.
As far as bridging the gap in the domestic situation in your current position, what do you think are the next steps that you should see at your place work as far as the ERGs are concerned, as far as diversity and inclusion? What would you like to see happen in those areas?
That's a good question. I think the first thing that comes to mind, I can only think in the form of conferences, and that is once you're educated and once you get rid of some biases that you might have about a different culture, during these conferences, people can take an active, asserted effort to, or be conscious effort to engage with people who are different than them, because those conferences are places where these people meet from different cultures and backgrounds. So that's the opportunity where you can really interface with different types of people.
What do you think might be the highest priority items that we should be talking about in these conferences?
I think one of them would be, from the D&I perspective, would be implicit bias, or biases that people might have about there's scientists everywhere, but people might have a bias towards scientists from this country or this country,
right,
because they're not really informed about some of the things that they're working on, or they might be coming to the table or conversation table with this preconceived stereotype of those people and what they actually do.
So as far as the technologies, are you aware of like any pressing technological needs as far as what we might see globally versus in the US? I think the US, we have more of a consumer culture. We're pretty developed. A lot of the things are kind of, pushing the boundaries that are already there. But if we're establishing foundations, what do you think we might need to see in those spaces?
Hold on. Brief? I'm just trying to, I have to think about that answer.
So, we have technology in the US that we're working on, and a lot of it is pushing the boundaries. Like, we're talking about smart homes, we're talking about IoT, and then we're talking about places where we're building infrastructure, and so the needs are going to be very different. So what do you see as, kind of the most pressing technological needs in those spaces versus what we're seeing in the US? Because in the US, we're going to focus on, the newest, greatest, flashiest thing versus maybe we want to focus on something that is more resource aware, like water management, something like that.
I guess my approach to trying to come to conclusion on that question is you have to talk to the people. We can't just lift and shift technologies from one country and say, hey, this is good for you too. But really kind of talking to people on the ground. Really, it's the whole mantra or concept of talk to the end users, figure out what they need, and build things for their needs. Because not everything that we do, like in the Western world, if you will, might not work on the continent. So it's really kind of talking to those, because from my perspective, it's more of some places are more agricultural, and I think their needs are going to be different than like some place in the United States where it's purely urban. And I think you really just have to talk to the end user.
I think we have a problem sometimes where we have Western research perspectives that are a little bit more paternalistic and kind of, as you said, kind of overseeing the viewpoints that they're pushing in certain areas, and we actually need to bridge the understanding between the two. So, following up on your empathy and education point as well, I think that's kind of where we need to be in that space. But I'm just agreeing with you.
And I think there's the flip side of that about what can we learn from like folks on the continent about
Right.
how to deal with certain things. For instance, and once again, this might be my own ignorance. I don't know if like the Western world has really studied how the continent deals with pandemics, and like the continent is very good at dealing with Ebola. Have we taken some of those lessons learned and transposed those to how we can deal with pandemics in the United States and other in the Western world? So it's kind of twofold where, yeah, we can provide folks with technology, but what can we bring from those areas into ours that might benefit society as well?
Oh, that's a very good point. I think the exchange is very important. Like, It shouldn't be this, I shall teach you.
Yeah.
Versus like, what can we learn from each other? So if you had the capability to work on any, project, like a dream project, what do you think that might be? Something that would be, in the theme of the series, bridging the gap between these two perspectives, or between these multiple perspectives that we're seeing in research?
So my true love is with plasma-based research and applications. So I think my dream position would be working with fusion. And I know people think fusion is a pipe dream, but I think we need to get away from nuclear fission and really talk about fusion as a way to deal with energy. And I think if we do it right, we can create portable energy devices that could be used in places that don't have infrastructure like we do here in the States to really kind of, because power, energy and power really kind of drive innovation to some extent.
Right.
And I think once you have enough energy and power and you can harness all this energy, you can apply that energy, the physical energy, not the people energy, but you can apply that energy to solve really tough problems like transportation. How can we transform transportation and how we move not only terrestrial but extraterrestrial or on the ground and in space?
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. Fusion power. I'd like to see it.
Yeah, I know.
So, you had to identify, conversely from, the dream to bridging the gap, if you had to identify what the current gap is as far as your perspective and maybe your field, that, we're not addressing in research in the U.S. that we could be addressing.
Ooh, that's a good question. In my field, I deal with DoD systems. So these systems kind of tend to be developed in stovepipes versus the commercial world where people are somewhat happy working in their stovepipe because they own the entire infrastructure.
What's a stovepipe?
Oh, so a stovepipe, a self-contained system. So, all right, when you talk about software and hardware systems, a stovepipe would be, I go to one third party, and they develop, like for the sake of argument, a sensor. Well, they create proprietary interfaces, and we're forced to go back to that company to develop the management tools, the thing that the analysts will look at. So all those things are controlled by one company. So part of my job is to try to open that up to bring in other third parties. And part of what I see is, and this is the part, the commercial world doesn't necessarily sometimes have these issues. They're starting to, and that's sort of where we're kind of those lessons that we need to learn from the commercial world. But I think how to break down these stovepipes and really give small businesses the opportunity to be able to bring capabilities in the door is really kind of one of those big things that's kind of one of the many things software related that I'm interested in.
When you have the established infrastructure, it's harder for smaller entities to kind of have input into that because it's kind of overruled.
And part of what I do is modernizing that to allow these third parties to come in. And I think it's just a little bit. I think we just need some innovative ideas around, and I think this is happening now when you talk about API management and things like that. But really, kind of thinking about how we can transform the DoD infrastructure to one that's a little bit more, less these stovepipes of stovepipes, but one where anyone can come in and integrate securely.
I want to say thank you for being here today and spending time with the series, and give you the opportunity to say anything you'd like to say to the viewers watching or to the general public or whoever you want to address.
Well, number one, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate it. I think that what you're doing here is great.
Thank you.
I think secondly, I want to just thank my friends and family, because I wouldn't be where I am today without a good support system. And I think that's an important thing that everyone needs throughout these journeys. Like, my parents couldn't have gotten to where they are today without the support of family, and friends. And I think having that support really kind of motivated me to get to where I am today.
Oh, wow.
So I just want to thank them.
Thank you for watching our series today. My name is Jay Whitebear. If you have a researcher you'd like to see on the series, or if you want to reach out with comments, please comment below. And you've been watching Bridging the Gap.